Hello and welcome to the first Facebook Live of 2021 here on CJS News. I'm Ness Jenkins and today we'll be discussing what's next for education in Wales following the Welsh Government's announcement today that the youngest children will be returning to schools on the 22nd of February. Joining us in the discussion will be Professor Chris Taylor from the School of Social Sciences and Tregenna School Head Teacher Rhys Harris.
And I'm Jacob Morris, and I'll be in the newsroom keeping an eye on our social media platforms to hear what you have to say at home.
Croeso mawr I chi'ch dau, welcome both. And it may be a good idea to start with you, Mr. Harris. What's your reaction to the government announcement today? Do you think it's a good idea for your children to start returning from the 22nd of February?
Yeah, thanks, Nest. I agree. I think most school leaders would say we just want the children back in school. There's some fantastic work going on online. I'm really proud of the work that my teachers have been able to do. But it isn't. This isn't homeschooling, okay? And I think sometimes people get confused. And this is something that's been forced upon us by a global pandemic. And as great as it isn't a substitute for children being in school with teachers.
Thank you, Rhys Harris. Professor Chris Taylor, would you say it's too soon for children to go back to school?
No, I mean, this is really welcome news, particularly for our young learners. In Wales, we have a leading early years education programme, the foundation phase, which encourages a variety of pedagogical processes and approaches which require face-to-face contact with the pupils and the teaching staff. So this is incredibly welcome for those particular groups. It's disappointing, I think, still that other children in Wales are not going to be able to go and return back to school, and we will be looking forward to kind of seeing the timeline for those other children to return as soon as possible.
Thank you both. As I mentioned earlier, Jacob will be keeping an eye on our social media pages. So Jacob, what are our viewers saying at the moment after this announcement?
Well, yes, Nest, as you can imagine, this announcement is causing quite the stir today, and many are watching with us here live. And Anna Hughes has actually got in touch. She's watching from North Wales, and she states that her mother works in a primary school, and she said that she's glad with the Welsh Government's announcement today. She says that it's wise that they are waiting for the numbers to come down before allowing pupils to return to school. But from what I'm gathering here in the newsroom is that there's one common concern amongst parents which are contacting us, and that is the mental health and well-being of pupils. Marta has contacted us. She's a part of the Us For Them campaign, a campaign group which wants to get pupils back to schools as soon as possible. And Nest, she's asking, does closing schools present a serious risk of harm to the mental well-being of children and young people?
Okay, thank you, Jacob. Well, let's ask that question to Mr. Rhys Harris then. With Children's Mental Health Week next week, do you think there's a serious risk to the mental well-being of our children? Do you fear for your pupils at school?
Yeah, Nest, staff are becoming better and better at dealing with children, but Chris made, a really valid point earlier about nothing being a substitute for face-to-face work. So, we're phoning, we are contacting children, and even the vulnerable children who sometimes find difficulty connecting online. We are trying to make every effort to get out to talk to them, to make sure that we are still in contact with them. But I'd have to say that, the children who are experiencing difficulty, maybe children who've had difficult backgrounds, some difficulty in the past, there are lots of key things that happen on a daily basis for them in school, and teachers who've been specifically trained to work with them that they really do miss during lockdown.
Thank you. We'll come on to the different backgrounds and those difficulties later on. But Professor Chris Taylor, what do you think the effect of this pandemic will have on mental health of children?
To be honest, every child is affected by this in terms of their well-being, and what's really hard is to predict exactly how that plays out in their lives. We have, children could face feelings of isolation and anxiety, which may not have been there before the pandemic. And just because of the current situation where maybe they're the only child at home, in some cases, children, their parents are still having to go to work because they have to go to their workplaces for their work. So they're facing serious degrees of isolation and loneliness. That itself, we can't predict exactly who they will be, and that's affecting different groups and different children across Wales. But there is a huge burden upon some of the schools with some of the most challenging communities that they work with, where they are doing a great job at resolving kind of child protection issues, for example. But all of that effort and that resource that they need to do and ensure that the children are safe, of course, is taking away from the opportunity and their capacity to actually deliver high quality learning.
Thank you. I'd like to bring Jacob in here because, Jacob, you've got some facts for us about this issue.
No, yes, you're correct. The new research by the Prince's Trust has found that 63% of 16 to 25-year-olds feel that the pandemic has caused them to feel more anxious and more often to feel anxious, that is. We've had a parent, we have a teacher that's contacted us, Bethany Woodcock. She's a teacher at a special education school, and she's concerned that children aren't being able to see each other face to face. And she's worried for people in unstable environments. Keep reacting at home. We'd love to hear from you here in the newsroom.
Yes, please do. And on that point of unstable environments at home, let's talk about inequality and the varying socio-economic backgrounds these children face at home. Professor Chris Taylor, you mentioned in a BBC article this week that some children will feel that they've left school at the age of 14 or 15 instead of 18 in terms of their learning. Now, that is a shocking statement. What do you think needs to be done to counterbalance these inequalities at home and to make sure our children get the education they deserve?
Yeah, inevitably, a lot of attention has been on closing schools, reopening schools, ensuring that the teaching and learning is being delivered online as best it can be. But what I'm really concerned about is what we put in place going forward, because to some extent, there's only so much we can do right now. And as I said, many of our resources need to be spent actually ensuring that children's well-being and their safety is being met. In terms of learning then, we have to think about what we're going to do next year and the year after that. What do we put in place to ensure that learners can continue their educational journeys, whether that be into post-compulsory education or higher education or into the labour market. And whilst I have little doubt that they will get the qualifications at the end of this year, for example, if you're in year 11 doing your GCSEs, they will still get those qualifications to allow them entry to next year's kind of post-16 education, sixth forms, whatever. But they will still be missing out on the educational experiences that they would have needed prior to that next phase of their learning. So there will be gaps in their knowledge and skills. And we need to find ways of filling that gap in as quickly as possible, because if we leave it too late, there will be no turning back. And there will be a generation of cohorts who will be affected for the rest of their lives because of this.
Okay, thank you. The government would say that they've already distributed 74,000 devices to local authorities in Wales to try and keep up with the digital needs of children in schools. But Mr. Harris, do you think the government are doing enough to help your pupils in your school? For example, in reality, how many laptops have you had?
Yeah, to be honest, Ness, I'm not sure whether this is reflected across Wales. Certainly within Cardiff, the local authority and our government have been really proactive. So I think we started looking at children who were having difficulty from the point of view of being able to source IT kit. But by now we are moving on to even families that maybe there's a bit of competition. If you've got 5 or 6 of us in the house all trying to use broadband at the same time, then it gets difficult. So we've even been able to help out that middle strata of pupils. I think that the point was made earlier, that this pandemic has quite laid bare social difficulties, though. And there are schools that struggle a lot more than Tregenna has done. And there are areas of the community in Cardiff, I talk with fellow head teachers, that they worry about. And it isn't just that digital deprivation. It's not a quick solution that you just give a child a laptop. because systematically these areas have not really had the resources and had the amount of staffing in schools that they need to support them, and to make sure that there isn't a divide, a socio-economic divide, affecting children's education right the way through school.
Professor Chris Taylor, what do you think should be done then in the next few years to make sure this gap is reduced as much as possible?
Yeah, well, there has to be programs in place which support children in their next leg of their journey, whatever it might be. There's obviously been the idea floated by the Education Policy Institute this morning, which is that some children should be, in effect, allowed to stay back a year. I actually have some serious reservations about that, and whether that has any even practical chance of ever happening. So instead, we've got to think about what is going to be in place next year. And providers, of course, are currently worrying about their current cohorts, but we need to start thinking about preparing children for the next stage. Children will go back into school before the summer. There's no doubt about it. We're beginning to see that happen after the February half term. So maybe we need to start thinking about what is it we need to do now in order to prepare children for the next stage of their journey. For example, if we're taking about year 11s, there will be a lot of pressure on secondary schools to introduce various forms of assessments in-house, which will be used to help guide and shape the grading and the qualifications of the children. But that will come at the expense of thinking about the kind of skills, knowledge and expertise that young people will need in order to be able to make good choices about their next educational decisions, whether that be their A-levels or BTECs or vocational or apprenticeships. And unless we put something in place now, those decisions we may end up being poor decisions and lead to problems later, such as low retention in post-compulsory education.
Okay, thank you. I want to touch briefly on Welsh language provision because 70% of pupils in Cardiff schools come from non-Welsh speaking backgrounds. And Jacob, you've got some people that have already contacted you about this issue.
Indeed, I have, Nest. Two teachers have contacted us here at CJS. One of them is Sione Jones. She's a primary school teacher in Ysgol Bro Morgannwg, and another teacher in secondary school, Plas Mawr, Dion Davies. And what they're telling me is their main concern is that pupils who are in the school and don't come from Welsh-speaking homes, they're worried about the fact that they're not speaking Welsh often, and this will impact their education. As well as teachers, we have more people contacting us. We have a parent that's also contacted us. She's from Canton. Rebecca Phillips is her name. Her children are in Welsh medium school, but she isn't a Welsh speaker herself. Now, she says she's finding it really difficult, and most of the time she's winging it. She's often having to resort to stuff like Google Translate to help her children with their work. And she's worried, therefore, that her children might fall behind.
Okay, Jacob. Mr. Harris, what would you say to parents such as Rebecca there, who fears that her children will lose their Welsh skills? Ysgol Treganna is obviously a Welsh medium school. What would you say to parents like that?
Yeah, do you know, Ernest, I think that you've identified a general worry here. You know, when we've talked about the pressure on children and the mental health of children, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on parents, and we quite often spend quite a bit of the week talking to parents, non-Welsh speaking parents especially, about not being too worried about where things are going. You can't do what you can't do. And then I said earlier in this interview, this isn't homeschooling. This is a situation that's been forced upon us. Now, there are plenty of avenues for children to hear Welsh and to practice Welsh. Already, schools, I think you mentioned about 63% of Cardiff children come from non-Welsh speaking homes. So the whole way the school is geared is to provide parents with translation, is to make sure that the parents understand what we're doing, how they can help. There's a wealth of stuff online. If you look at the BBC, S4C, plenty of stuff going on. And there's a page with the government supporting your children in the use of Welsh language at home. So there's plenty of avenues of help there. But I think it's really important that the parents don't feel too pressurized at this point. Primary school, fine, they will get the language, they will pick up the language. I come from a non-Welsh speaking home, and that attitude and positiveness towards different languages and bilingualism, I think, is the big deal. And you know, whereas I'd like children to hear as much music and to take part in Welsh discussions with friends, it's the attitude is the essential thing.
So would you say that you're not worried that the Welsh language will be affected at all by this pandemic?
Oh, do you know what? I think it's inevitable. You know, education and people's progress will be affected by this pandemic. But I find myself quite often writing to parents saying to them, look, you know, your children will remember how they feel about this lockdown period for a lot longer than they'll be affected by the education of it. You know, it's not in any way to demean or to look at the fact that their education isn't under pressure, but their mental health and their attitude and their positivity is really, really important here. And, you know, it's much more important than parents stressing out because something they can't do anything about.
Okay, thank you. I'll just ask Professor Chris Taylor quickly. Do you think the lack of Welsh speaking at home will impact the children's understanding in the future?
Absolutely, this is a real issue and a particular challenge that Wales faces because of a significant Welsh medium school system. Now, I think all those issues that Ms. Harris has just highlighted actually show and demonstrate the impact on every learner, though. Social processes of learning are so central to the way in which children and not adults learn and memorize and remember, recall, experience other things. And those social processes often come through the schools. They give children opportunities to experiment with new ideas and be exposed to new ideas, to be enlightened by new ideas. In their homes, which is where they're spending most of their time and not even having any social interaction outside the home, those social processes are very limited. And I've not seen much evidence of social learning, i.e. children learning in groups, as much as we would have liked to have seen over the last year, particularly during those lockdown periods. And I think that impacts negatively on every learner, irrespective of their language of instruction. But I do agree that this will exacerbate a particular issue for those children who particularly live in English medium households who are in Welsh medium schools, and they will struggle. They will be behind on their linguistic skills. And there's another good example of perhaps we need to put something in place during the summer of this year, specifically for certain groups, where we can find a way of kind of mitigating the impact that this pandemic has had on their learning, specifically in this case around their linguistic skills. Absolutely.
Okay, Rhys Taylor, would you welcome that idea to bring the children in throughout the summer months?
Sorry. Yeah, I can feel the need for this language issue, and it is a difficult one. You know, I think I mentioned before that I come from a non-Welsh speaking home, and attitude and your ability to work with the language and to enjoy the language is really, really important to us. You know, we can get children to 11 years old and they can be completely fluent. We know how to teach them to speak a language. But then the step forward is, why should they use the language? And it's quite an important point with the Welsh language. So, you know, that skill element has to be an enjoyment thing. And it's very important. I think you talk to most bilingual schools or Welsh schools, and we really put a lot of effort into making sure that we are giving children as many experiences through the medium of Welsh as we can. And that takes time and takes investment. So anything we can do to add on to it, I think is really vital. But you heard the First Minister talk earlier now about extending the investment. And yeah, we need people. We need people to actually be doing this. You know, the teachers, by the time we get to the summer, are going to be exhausted. They are flat out now, to be frank. So yeah, it'd be really good if we could get some, you know, element of enjoyment. Mentor Caerdydd, these people who hold summer clubs in school, that's already happening. You know, the framework is there for it, and it would be, from the children's point of view, something they just enjoy. It wouldn't be lessons. It wouldn't be, oh, I've got to go to school. It would be, oh, great, we're going to have fun today, and you know, we're being provided with this. It's an ideal way of just giving the language a little boost over the summer.
Okay, well, we start a little debate here. Jacob, how are things looking on social media? Is the debate on our platforms there as well?
Yes, Nest, lots have been in contact sharing their opinions. Ryan Bright says, it's really sad to see schools won't be reopening. I don't think the government are truly seeing how difficult it is to balance time and work, giving children the best education that they need. Ian Hargraves has also been in contact with us as well. He's asking, what do teachers think of the quality of these bite-sized lessons and the services that the BBC are offering? Additionally, Annette Everly has been in contact with us as well. She's a teacher in Swansea, and she's fed up with misconceptions that people are saying that teachers are lazy and they don't want to be back in school. Well, thank you all for getting in touch and reacting. Please continue to do so in the comments section below. But back to you, Nest.
Well, thank you, Jacob. Mr. Harris, I'll just ask you very quickly, do you think that people think that teachers are lazy during this period?
No, I don't think. I do certainly. That's not my feedback from the parents that I work with, and as you can imagine, you know, I meet with my staff quite regularly and talk with the hundreds of parents we've got at home, as well as the 70, 80 parents that are with us in school because they've got children who are a key worker. Sorry, children because they're key workers. My staff are working flat out. They're working really hard. But I think the point is that, you know, we'd all really like to be back in school. You know, everybody wants things to be safe. But I think this phased return, and you know, people have got to be patient with the government. They're trying to react very quickly to a rapidly changing environment. And, you know, there's a proviso with the reopening that it will be, if the R rate continues to get less, you know, even in school, you know, you think about children arriving at school, with 700-800 pupils coming into school, I've got to be worried about keeping those parents apart. You know, there's a social interaction between mums and dads there, without even thinking about, you know, the school, which I can control a lot better. So I think phased return, carefully working toward, is something that the staff want to see, is something the parents want to see, and I'm encouraged today to see there's something that the government want to see as well.
Thank you. You said there that teachers are working flat out, they're working so hard. Professor Chris Taylor, do you think they should be vaccinated? This is another topic that's very debatable at the moment. Do you think teachers should be vaccinated before children return?
Yeah, this is something I've been arguing for the last month or so. Absolutely, I can't understand why teachers are not high up on the priority list. Of course, there is an argument that there's a trade-off here between putting somebody ahead of somebody else on the vaccine list, and I know politicians kind of can argue around the houses about whether that's in practice what would happen. I think the reality is it would happen, but there are various kind of redefinitions of what is an NHS worker. So there are many volunteers currently who work for the NHS who are now being prioritised for the vaccine. So there are ways in groups who are being given a kind of reprioritisation by government, and I just don't understand why school staff of any age, doesn't really matter, are not being prioritised for the vaccines, because they're taking huge risks themselves by working with young people, particularly the older age groups. And I just think this shows a lack of kind of trust and support from the government towards the staff. And it would demonstrate to everybody that this is a key way of ensuring that schools can reopen as quickly as possible and give everybody confidence, both parents, teachers, and the pupils themselves, that it's a safe environment to go back to. Because otherwise, many people will not even return if we leave it too late.
Rhys Harris, would you agree there that teachers should be vaccinated? How would you feel if all your staff were to be vaccinated?
Yeah, you know, I think, Nest, as I said before, at primary school as well, I think we are beginning to feel a little bit safer that the smaller children don't seem to be so much of a risk. Yeah, great if we can vaccinate staff. I know that it would make them feel more confident and happy about coming back into school. But please, you know, let's remember that your school isn't just about the school. It doesn't start in a safe environment at 9 o'clock in the morning and end at Tapestry. All those children travel to school with their parents. All their parents come and collect them from school. So the level of social interaction there isn't something that's going to go away. So great if we can vaccinate teachers, but let's remember that, you know, it is also a social mixed situation as well, opening schools.
Well, thank you both. I'll come to you, Jacob, for one final time. What's the reaction like on social media at the moment?
Yeah, well, it's great. Thank you to everyone that's been contacting us during the last half an hour. Vaccinations, of course, a very, very important point that people are raising. We have Harry Payne saying, could prioritise vaccinations for teachers alongside the NHS staff, which would get the children back into school and create a positive knock-on effect for those families. So I imagine this discussion will go on long into the weekend and on to the coming weeks. But once again, thank you for everyone who's been in touch. Back to you, Nest.
Thank you, Jacob, and thanks for keeping an eye on our social media pages. But our greatest thanks this afternoon goes to our experts, Professor Chris Taylor and Mr. Rhys Harris. Thanks for making time in your busy schedules to speak to us today, for reacting to the Welsh Government announcement and to share your experiences. And that's all from us. You can follow this story and all the other stories from CJS News on our website, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and TikTok. But for now, diolch yn fawr, goodbye.